Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 3, Part 1. In the first part of this lecture, we are going to talk about the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the 5th edition's definition of intellectual disability, and then also just lay some groundwork, just some basic statistical stuff so we can really help understand intellectual functioning and how it's measured. IQ, or intellectual functioning, is measured through standardized measures. So it's important to understand what those scores mean. In your text, they'll talk about standardized scores and they'll talk about the psychometric properties. So I just want to give you guys a little bit of background so that information can be more accessible and more meaningful for you. So we are going to first talk about, though, the DSM-5 definition. If you're looking at the DSM-5 definition, they call it also an intellectual disability, just like the AAIDD, or also intellectual developmental disorder. And it's defined as a disorder with onset during the developmental period, so that's similar to the AAIDD's definition. And it also includes both intellectual and adaptive functioning deficits in conceptual, social, and practical domains. And that's referring to those adaptive behaviors that we talk about. So it's important to look at this and see how you think it relates when I'm going to go through the next couple slides. Think about the similarities that you see in the DSM-5's definition to the AAIDD's definition, and also think about maybe some of the differences. Where are some things that it's lacking? Maybe what are some things that it does a little bit better than the AAIDD? And the bottom line is that you are pretty similar. But the DSM-5 is what is used by clinical psychologists or school psychologists to make the definition, so to diagnose, and those are the only folks that can diagnose. So it's important to see how this relates to the AAIDD's definition. All right, so when we're looking at the DSM-5, then there are 3 criteria that must be met. And the first one, criteria A, refers to intellectual functions. So intellectual functioning is typically measured by individualized, administered, and psychometrically valid, comprehensive, culturally appropriate, psychometrically sound tools. And these are measures of standardized intelligence. So we're looking, again, it kind of gives a definition of intellectual functioning. We'll kind of talk a little bit about that. But criterion A, again, really gets at the intellectual functioning piece. It talks about how the score in intellectual functioning has to be 2 standard deviations or more below the population's mean, including the margin of error, and that's generally plus or minus 5 points. So then we're looking at a score of about 65 to 75. When this is going to be really important and why the score matters is because when we're looking, again, especially at being eligible for services, folks that fall right on that borderline. So maybe someone that has a score of 72 or someone that has a score of 65, or what about if they have a score of 76? It's really important to take that margin of error into account and apply that when you're looking at the score. And that's why I'm going to get in a little bit to just a little bit about the scores and measurement in general, so you can really understand the importance of that score and understand how to interpret it. When we're looking at criterion B, this looks at adaptive functioning. This includes adaptive reasoning in 3 domains, those that conceptual, social, and practical. Criterion B is met when at least one domain of adaptive functioning, conceptual, social, or practical, is sufficiently impaired enough that it needs ongoing help or ongoing supports. Again, thinking back to this and applying how this how this is similar to that multidimensional framework, and really thinking about the supports that are needed to help maximize functioning there. Give some examples of activities of daily living, but the criterion B really gets at that deficit in adaptive functioning. And then when we look at criteria C, this gives some credit to the fact that the intellectual and adaptive deficits have to occur during that developmental period. Additionally, what the DSM-5 definition does have are these specifiers. And the specifiers are meant to communicate the level of support that's needed across each domain. It's not the same thing as the mild, moderate, and severe that we've talked about in the first lecture with more of those traditional models. But the specifier is used to say what level of support they need, not what level of difficulty they have. The use of specifiers is used across all of the neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism spectrum disorder, which we'll talk a little bit more about at the beginning of Module 2. But the specifiers also include an age of onset as well. It also helps let us know whether or not the neurodevelopmental disorder, which includes intellectual disability, may be associated with a specific medical condition, like a seizure disorder or genetic condition like trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, or environmental factors like low birth weight. The various levels of severity are defined on the basis of adaptive functioning and not IQ scores. Again, we're looking at the level of support that's needed based on the adaptive level deficits. Because adaptive behaviors really tell us how much support an individual is going to need. And the different specifiers include mild, moderate, severe, and profound. But again, they apply to the level of support they need in the area of adaptive functioning as opposed to the IQ range. Alrighty, so now what we're going to do, I'm going to move this just a little bit up here. All right, so now I'm going to show you guys, this is an example of a normal curve. You've probably seen this in, if you've taken statistics or a research methods class, you've seen this normal curve before. And what this normal curve says is, this is many human phenomenon, including like height, weight, and IQ fall along this normal curve. And what it's saying is that the majority of our scores, our IQ scores, or people that take IQ tests, are going to fall in this average range here. So what we're looking at here is about, our average score is 100 with a standard deviation of 15, all right? And what we want to look at here is, when we're talking about intellectual disability, we're talking about an IQ score that's approximately 2 standard deviations from the mean. So 1, 2, considering the standard error of measure, and that depends on the IQ test. Again, this is important so you understand the scores that we're talking about, and also the percentage of the population we're talking about, which is a small percentage of the population. So when we're talking about intellectual disabilities, we're talking about a very small section of the population that earn those IQ scores. So again, the average score being 100, this says deviation IQ. Once we're getting 70 or below, considering the standard error of measure, this is the population that we're talking about in this course when we're talking about intellectual disabilities. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how individual scores are described, because when you take IQ tests, there are many different types of scores that you may get. The first type are developmental scores. And the reason why these are italicized, because these are usually reported as grade or age equivalents. It's really important to note that these are really not psychometrically sound scores. They use kind of some fancy statistics, estimate scores between point values. They extend norms or extend the norms to scores that weren't actually obtained by the sample. And they don't take that normal curve that I just talked about here into account when interpreting them. So they really, really should be used very cautiously. They can be confusing because they assume a certain measure of performance that was never obtained. But again, they're usually presented as age or grade equivalents, which makes them very accessible to the population. And that's why I want to take some time just to explain what standard scores and percentile ranks are, because those are pretty psychometrically sound. And so when we're looking at interpreting the IQ scores for individuals, specifically with intellectual disabilities, it's important that you guys have a good understanding of the standard score and percentile ranks, because they're valid and they really do a nice job at explaining these. Developmental scores, while they may seem easy, they're just not as good as standard scores and percentile ranks. So we never, ever, ever want to use those, or if they're reported, if an IQ score is ever presented as an age equivalent or a grade equivalent, ask to see the standard score and the corresponding percentile rank so you can get a better understanding. All right, so when we're talking about norm reference scores, we're talking about an IQ score, so a deviation IQ score, where a person's performance on a test is compared to the performance on a general population, so other individuals their same age. It's used because the number of correct responses, also known as raw scores, are not very meaningful. The way that IQ tests are made, they get increasingly more difficult, but it's not like they get more difficult on an equal interval. So it's not like they get increasingly difficult in a same manner from 1 to 1. So understanding that someone got 5 correct on an IQ test isn't really meaningful. Those scores are transformed into deviation IQ scores or standard scores, and that really tells us, then we can look at an individual's relative standing in a group, and you really can see where they fall in relation to other individuals their same age. It's important to note that when we're looking at norm reference measures for individuals with intellectual disabilities, remember, they comprise a smaller portion of the population. So they're not as represented in normative samples as typically developing individuals. So making sure that you understand that, and that is what, and looking and making sure when you use an IQ test, or if someone uses an IQ test and you're looking at the score, really having a good understanding of the norm group and making sure people with intellectual disabilities were included in that norm group, to make sure that the score is actually representative of other people, typically developing people, but also people like them. Oh, those were notes about norm groups, just making sure they're representative of the population and that people with disabilities are in that group. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about standard scores, percentile ranks, and standard deviations. So again, standard scores are initially raw scores that have been transformed. So they have a predetermined mean and standard deviation. Most IQ scores have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So anywhere between 85 and 115 is considered the average range. You can go back and reference that normal curve that I showed you. So again, when our population, we're talking about a score of 70 plus or minus the standard error of measure, which is usually about 5 points in either direction. Our standard deviations tell us how much we expect a score to deviate from the mean. And typically IQ scores have a standard deviation of 15. Percentile ranks are derived scores that permit you to kind of look at an individual's position relative to the standard population. You guys have probably gotten these when you take like the GREs or SATs. They can make it really easy for parents, teachers, and individuals to understand. So for example, if someone falls at the 2nd percentile, that means they did as well or better than 2% of other individuals their same age that took that exam. So it's really helpful if the percentile rank is reported with the standard score, so that way folks understand where that score would fall when compared to other individuals their same age. Again, percentile ranks do get a bit, they're a little less reliable on the tail ends of that normal curve there because there are fewer individuals in that norm group there. So it's important just to make sure that they still should be interpreted with a little more caution. They're still good and they're still sound to use, much better than developmental scores, which we shouldn't use, but they should be also reported with their corresponding standard score, and that standard score is standard deviation. All right, I'm going to pause here for this, and the second half of this lecture is going to look at definitions of intelligence and IQ, so that way we can understand what IQ and intelligence is, since we're talking about it a lot with this population and what it means for this population, because it's a critical part of diagnosing an individual with intellectual disability. And it's also a part of that operational definition and that multidimensional framework, or that constitutive definition. So stay tuned for more, and I'll see you guys soon. Thanks so much.